Welcome to Retina Health for Life from the President's Corner, brought to you by the American Society of Retina Specialists. I'm your host, Dr. Tim Murray, coming to you from Miami. On each episode, we'll bring you inspiring conversations about your sight and the special role the retina plays in making healthy vision possible. We'll hear from expert retina specialists as well as directly from patients about living life to the fullest with retinal disease. Join us and learn how to safeguard your retina health for life. Hello, I'm Dr. Timothy Murray, a retina specialist for the American Society of Retina Specialists. On this episode of ASRS's Retina Health for Life, we're going to talk about a technological advance called the artificial retina, which has helped people with certain inherited and blinding diseases to regain some degree of their sight. To discuss this development and the technological breakthroughs associated with it, I'm pleased to welcome my friend and fellow retina specialist and the co-inventor of the artificial retina, Dr. Mark Humayun. Dr. Humayun is the co-director of the USC's Roski Eye Institute and is a world-renowned expert on vision restoration. Welcome, Mark.
Thank you, Tim. It's a pleasure for me to be with you.
It's a pleasure to have you here. Mark, it seems almost like science fiction to be able to restore the sight of a patient who has been blind or nearly blind for years. But you've really made your mark and a passion focus of your career to recover vision. Can you tell us a little bit about how that journey began for you and what you really focused on?
Well, the journey began a long time ago, nearly 3 decades ago, and it started really with a personal motivation on my part. My grandmother started to go blind from complications of diabetes, diabetic retinopathy, and I wasn't really even interested in ophthalmology. I was interested always in nerve cells and neurons, but her blindness really made me think about and focus about developing new treatments for ophthalmology, in particular retinal blindness. From there, of course, just like you said, it was the idea was to put a chip in the eye to restore sight to the blind. There was some early work going on. Cochlear implants were in fact early in clinical trials, had just gotten approved. There was some electrical stimulation that neurosurgeons were doing in the brain, stimulating vision center of the brain, and the patient would see, oh, I'm seeing spots of light, even though there was no light. So it made me think, well, if cochlear implants can work for the deaf, electrical stimulation of the visual pathway can elicit these spots of light. Can we actually put something into the eye to create a grid of spots of light? And then that would, much like a scoreboard or an LED screen, then create shape and form vision. But that's kind of where we started, and we sort of started very naively, as you could imagine. And it took the full 30 years to get to where we needed to.
It was really amazing to first develop, even conceptually, the approach to artificially stimulate the retina. But I don't think any one of us would have really believed that you could do it. So can you tell us what some of the challenges were? I mean, it seems to me you have to develop the chip and you have to handle the processing and you've got to talk about a power supply, and then you're talking about putting something inside a patient's eye, which has been pretty much virgin territory for us in the past. So how did you approach that, and what type of a team did you put together to do it?
Well, Tim, you're exactly right. So many facets of this were unknown, from the surgical approach to the electronics to the materials to even the camera, what kind of video processing was needed. And of course, given that so many things were unknown, we had to sort of start where we could, and most of the people didn't believe it at all. So none of the funding agencies, of course, believed it. So there was very little to no funding. It turns out that the engineers were more excited about it than the physicians. And since I have a PhD in engineering, we initially got our first grants in engineering, and they wanted to build this device. They wanted to build the computer chip, and so we started there, and we built some computer chips. We did some very rudimentary testing in some amphibians, some frogs, a retina. You could imagine there was very, very little money. So, but all that changed pretty dramatically when we took the first blind patient, and we were able to put tiny wires into the patient's eye while they were under local anesthesia so they could respond to us. And when that first patient saw the spot of light, and he'd been blind for 50 years from retinitis pigmentosa, this condition, as you and I know it too well, to blind people because it damages the photoreceptors, and it's an inherited retinal degeneration. He had a twin brother who was similarly blind. And so when he saw that first spot of light to that controlled electrical stimulation, that really changed the day, because we knew now that we were on the right track. And then funding was easy, and with funding we could put larger teams together. And then Second Sight, a company, was formed a decade or so later to make the implant. So it just went very incrementally and went very slowly initially because of lack of belief, lack of funding. But the engineering community believed, and so we got going. And then this really pivotal short acute test that we did in this blind person really turned the tables.
So Mark, what was that like for you and the patient? I've had a few moments where I've been in the lab and with the patient and done something, and it's like life-changing. So how did you feel at that moment? What was your team like? And then what was the patient like?
If we go back to the operating room, and I still remember it just as if it was yesterday, there was a lot of tense moments. And the reason is because we were trying and stimulating, and the patient was seeing nothing. And the patient was not seeing anything for about 20 minutes. And we were checking all the electronics, all the circuits. And it turns out that because he hadn't seen in so long, he didn't realize that the light was going to be this dim light. And he said, oh, after about 20 minutes, are you talking about that little candle brightness, small light in the distance? And we knew that was the light because we could change the frequency of stimulation. So we could make 1 a second and have him count out loud, or we could make it 1 every 2 seconds. So if he could track the frequency, we knew he was seeing the pulse. But it was a combination of him not seeing for a very long time and this very tense moment. But I can tell you, the moment he said he saw something and we were sure he did, it still remains, one of the happiest moments and defining moments of my professional career. And our team, you sort of see these team things in Apollo when, they land and everybody jumps up for joy. It was literally like that. Everybody jumped for joy, and we almost came out of our scrubs in the operating room and, took our masks off, but we didn't. So all that to say is it was really a fantastic moment. Can't forget it to this day.
And when the patient realized that he was seeing, what was that like for him?
Initially, he underplayed it, and I think, but just because he was in the operating room and we were under local anesthesia, and we couldn't completely block his optic nerve. You could imagine. So there were some things, but right after the procedure, he was ecstatic. But things really changed when we developed the Argus One, and I asked him, and I offered it to him. I said, I promised you that you'll be the first person, if you like, to get the Argus One, and he didn't hesitate. He got it, and when he saw for the first time with the Argus One a large letter, he started to cry with joy, because that was real now. He could actually see. It was a big letter H, and then an I. We wanted him to read high. So all these great things. But I think at that first time, he was excited, but he didn't fully understand, the patient, that is. But then when we implanted the Argus One, was a completely different day for the patient, and of course all of us as well.
So, Mark, in many ways, I think you were a unique individual to be able to do that. You're an outstanding surgeon. You're an engineer. You have the right motivation from your own family experience. Um, what do you think pivoted you to continue to do this? Because I know a lot of people that really felt strongly that this would never work in a functional way.
Yeah, well, you're right. Even though we showed that spot of light and we started with the Argus tests, there were a lot of questions, and everybody thought, well, okay, even if you can show spots of light, they're not going to be able to see, and it's not going to be very useful vision. But then, as we started to show with the Argus One that they could see large letters, recognize large objects, then the questions were, well, okay, but the Argus One was a bigger device. It had to be implanted behind the ear. The cabling had to go into the eye a long ways, and so everybody said, well, this is not anything that will be used, and so that prompted us to develop the Argus 2, which you can put all around the eye and into the eye, something that you and I, vitreoretinal surgeons, can perform without the need for a plastic surgeon or an ENT, ear, nose, and throat surgeon. So, and the procedure got shorter in time from the Argus One. Still a long procedure, but shorter. So I think once we started to do that, and then had more electrodes, so quote unquote more pixels, more resolution, and so that started to really address each of the questions. And then we got to a certain level of vision, and then there was like, okay, but can we actually improve more on it? And that's where we are right now. We're just seeing, I believe, just the tip of the iceberg. We can go a lot further with the resolution if we continue to develop this sort of a device.
Well, it seems like all along you've been kind of right at the tip of the spear of manufacturing processes. I mean, you were doing things that had never been done before. Implanting devices, you made choices about where to put the implant on top of the retina as opposed to under the retina. I mean, I look at this and I still marvel at what you've accomplished, but it seems to me that Argus 1 was proof of principle. Argus 2 got you doing something a little bit more, but I think all of us are really waiting for your next step. So could you take us through a little bit about what you think the future might hold?
Yeah, the future currently is actually has two products that are being developed. One by Second Sight, who's developing what's called the Orion implant. The Orion is a sister or brother to Argus, and it's implanted into the visual center of the brain. It basically has similar electronics, similar size of the Argus, similar materials, electrodes. For the most part, it's a little bit different. The brain requires a bit more current, so it has to be a little bit more powerful, so to speak, higher voltage implant. But all that to say is that's being developed, and so that's for patients obviously who don't have an eyeball altogether or who don't have a functional optic nerve. So that's being developed by Second Sight, and it's been implanted in 5 subjects to date. And they're starting to get results just similar to what the early Argus 2 results were, and we will see what comes of it. Second Sight's doing that. Separately, I'm developing with a company called IntelliMicro and GoldenEye Bionics. They've come together, GoldenEye Bionics and IntelliMicro, to develop the next high-resolution retinal implant. And so I'm happy to report, actually, we are just getting, hopefully our manuscript will be accepted, but we implanted 5 subjects with a 256 electrode device, which is 4 times the resolution of the Argus. It's half the size, so it fits you only need to put it in 1 quadrant of the eye, and it's still, like you said, on top of the retina, epiretinal. It's got a lot of new features, lots of new features. It's got visible camera with infrared camera features. It's got zoom features. It's got considerable amount of horsepower in the new chip. So the new chip, the new electrodes, the new implant It's very exciting, and so I think that will also continue. So, in a nutshell, there are two ways: one towards the brain, and one continuing to develop one for the retina.
So you focused initially, of course, on the retina, and you're moving that forward, sort of miniaturizing the technology, but maximizing the resolution. That seems to me, if that's can be reproducibly manufactured, that's just a huge step forward in something that we already know works. So I find that kind of really exciting from a patient perspective.
Yeah, it's super exciting. We are very excited about it. Second Sight didn't have the bandwidth to do both, so they elected to do the Orion, and I'm just glad to report that, two other companies banded together and continued to develop the retinal implant.
Yeah, I think when we talk to our patients and we talk about these major advances, the behind the scenes story of how they're developed and the shoestring budgets that often are in place at the beginning kind of reminds me of starting vitrectomy, in the garage, or computing technology in the garage. I don't see you in the garage, but I certainly see you really pushing forward with a vision that really doesn't let things like funding or practicalities almost get in the way. So I think that's an amazing thing for our patients. Mark, what's the timeline, do you think, for a next generation retinal implant?
I think that we'll see what level of patient data is required. Given that there's a lot of experience with the Argus 2, it's a different device in many ways, but the surgery is the same in some ways. And I'm hoping that we don't have to do too many patients and for too long. But it can take 2 to 3 years to bring another device online because you are really it's significantly different. It's just not a software upgrade. Software upgrades are easier. We did them with the Argus 2, and they can be approved quickly. But when you're doing a major hardware revision, it can take 2 to 3 years. So that's sort of the time frame, I would say.
So when that happens for us, one of the things that was also an impediment early was the cost of the procedure and the device itself. In the world now where we're doing some gene therapies that are costing almost $1 million an eye, it does put the implant into a different perspective. So what do you think in terms of how we look at funding research like this? But once we've got devices, how do we look at making them available to patients at a more broad level?
Yeah, that's a very, very good question. And one of the reasons the Argus was so expensive was because the yield, what we call is the engineering yield. So we would make 10 and only 1 or 2 would pass. So we revamped the manufacturing. So the verification and validation of the devices are such now that 9 out of 10 pass. So the moment that starts to happen off an assembly line, you can envision that this price would be 20% of what the Argus 2 price would be, something like that. I mean, I'm really hoping we can make this device affordable not only for the first world but for the third world. And the only way we were going to get that there is if we really re-looked at how we were going to manufacture it and how we were going to increase the reliability. And robotics alone, robotic assembly does help, but it wasn't going to be the entire solution. So we had to re-engineer the microfabrication, and now we're there. These 5 implants that were done had all 256 electrodes working, all of them. And so that kind of yield really drives the price down.
So I think that's amazing because, for many of our patients, this was out of reach. And because of the expense, many of our insurance carriers weren't really willing to buy into this. So expanding the impact on the patient, but also decreasing the device cost and the concerns for the device surgical implantation, I think are huge. So to me, this is really a big step from from device one to device two, but really a big step to this next device.
Yeah, I mean, I'm super excited. A lot of hard work, a lot of people working on this. I'm just here speaking to you about this, but I mean, the team is enormous. The investment that's gone into this latest device is also considerable, but we're gonna reap the dividends from it. I think it's definitely going to both be more helpful to patients, but also at an affordable cost.
So, Mark, for our patients and families that are going to listen to this, I think you're giving them a lot of potential hope in the future, and maybe not a too distant future, which I also think is important. Who do you see this device benefiting earliest? So I know you were very selective in who you chose to implant, trying to weigh the benefit with whatever perceived risk there was. So who's do you think is going to be your ideal first 50 patients?
Well, we're going to start with patients with retinitis pigmentosa, this condition we talked about, and people with pretty degenerated retina and loss of vision. Now, we don't have to go all the way down to people who are completely blind. Given the resolution on this implant, I think we can, go up the scale, so to speak, and implant in patients who may have count fingers vision and, can see better than what the Argus was approved for. And that's a dramatic increase in numbers, because if you're just looking for people who are totally blind, and they are there, the numbers are much, much smaller than the moment you get into, patients who can still barely see hand movement or can barely see count fingers, and you can also improve their vision in their lives. So I think with the higher resolution implant, with the higher vision that it can provide, I think that it will be moved up in that scale, so it can help patients with retinitis pigmentosa who are not completely blind, but who are very severely visually impaired.
But Mark, also to me, I look at, I was in clinic today like you are, and I'm in the OR, looking at patients that have really severe visual compromise from much more common diseases, from severe macular degeneration where there's atrophic change. And in spite of our big advances with anti-VEGF therapy, with injection treatments, the ability to preserve vision, there are still patients that need something more. And I know we have several things in the pipeline to help them, but I've always thought that would be an interesting opportunity for these patients with really bad vision when your prosthesis took that next step. So what do you think about patients with bad AMD where they're literally counting fingers, which you and I do still see?
Yeah, I think that's a very exciting area because they do have peripheral vision. So the electronic vision will have to work with the normal peripheral vision. This is currently being done in cochlear implants. We talked about them earlier. They're being implanted in partially deaf patients who have normal hearing, and they use the electronic implant with it. So, this is going to be a very interesting chapter. How do you work the electronic vision with the normal vision? And in our case, of course, the other eye is providing, will also be providing some level of vision. So where that comes out is going to be very interesting, but I'm very excited and enthusiastic and looking forward to it because cochlear implants have worked well in this setting.
I think it's very exciting too because we talk about whether one eye could be the nearsighted, visually functioning, reading or computer eye, and the periphery is maintained, or the other eye maintains peripheral function. But to bring us back, it in some ways you're stepping into that territory of your grandmother with the diabetes, where we've lost vision, but the optic nerve functions. There's still function within the retina. So it seems to me that this next generation broadens the opportunity for patients potentially.
Yes, and in macular degeneration, also the inner retina, I mean, not to get too technical, but the remaining retina is more healthy than in patients with retinitis pigmentosa. So that allows us, the keyboard, to enter electrical pulses in a much better way than in patients who've been blind for 40 or 50 years, because in macular degeneration, it's later onset, so it's been there for 10 years, maybe 15 or 20 at the most, not 50. So that allows a better preservation of the remaining neurons, and therefore better ability for us to interface the electronics. So everything points to the fact that we should be able to do it, and I'm excited to advance this technology to patients with end-stage macular degeneration.
Mark, what do you tell your patients now who have low vision or near blindness? What are you recommending for them? Who do they see? Where do they go? And then it does seem to me that we're offering them some hope that's on a fairly near time horizon. So what do you do for those patients to get them as functional as possible before one of these breakthroughs becomes available?
Well, I tell them, clearly, if they have high pressure glaucoma, I make sure that is well managed and controlled. We don't want their optic nerve to get damaged. If they have edema or swelling in the retina, I try to get that to be not large cystic changes, but large cysts of fluid, but try to get that more under control. Certainly try to avoid a big bleed in the eye. So these sorts of things, just general health of the eye. We try to preserve the eye and look at it with the different optics than saying, well, the horse is out of the barn, so nothing more to do here. I really do try to preserve those eyes, and then I do refer them, as you say, to low vision specialists. I think they can make a profound impact. I always tell my patients, look, this is eye tech. It's technology for the eye. It's wearable. It comes in different formats, from digital to just optics-based magnifiers and lighting systems. But please try these out, because they could make a difference in the interim. No surgery required. If you don't like them, you don't have to buy or use them. So I think that resonates well with them. So keeping the eye as healthy as possible for future treatments, as well as offering them low vision.
So I think that's a really important point, Mark, because I think that many of us in the past felt that those eyes had little potential, but I think that you and I, and now many of our colleagues, are understanding that preserving function for our patients, even patients with relatively low vision, is critically important. Not just for the advances that we're talking about today, but even on a day-to-day basis, that those, I feel so strongly that you just don't give up on the patient's vision and their eye. I think that's important for them functionally, but I also think it plays a major role in how they think of themselves in their future. So I think you and I would agree that being aggressive with these patients and maintaining their function is critical. That's a different thought than a decade ago.
Yeah, every bit of vision counts. And what I've learned, and I think you have too, is that for me, from more the Argus experience, that even a little bit, if you were in a gymnasium and you couldn't see anything, you wouldn't know where to go. But the moment we put a light on the exit, you know where the exit door is. So just light perception versus no light perception in patients is such a big difference. So absolutely 100% agree. Try to save every bit of vision, and even the little bit of vision that you can restore can have profound effects.
Well, for the patients and the families and the friends that are listening tonight, I'd like to thank you for what you've done to restore vision for these patients, and really for giving these patients hope, but also for continuing to passionately commit to the next generation of vision for our patients. And I think the future is remarkable, in large parts thanks to the work that you brought to our field.
Thank you, Tim, and again, thank you for having me.
Thanks, Mark. Thanks for joining us. That's Dr. Mark Humayun from the USC Roski Center, co-director of the Visual Restoration Program. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you, Tim.
Thanks for tuning in to Retina Health for Life from the President's Corner. You can watch and listen to more episodes on the ASRS YouTube channel and on popular podcast directories, including Apple Podcast, Google Podcast, and Spotify. For even more information about safeguarding your vision for a lifetime, visit asrs.org/patients and follow ASRS on both Facebook and Twitter. Retina Health for Life is made possible in part through generous support from the Foundation of the American Society of Retina Specialists, Allergan, Genentech, Novartis, and Regeneron Pharmaceuticals. See you soon.